Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thank you all for coming to this panel event hosted by the Junior Women's Network. My name's Shanice McAnuff and I'm a trainee solicitor here at Ashust. I chair the Junior Women's Network, which is a part of the wider Women's Network, but is made up of trainee solicitors and junior lawyers. We work to support the engagement of women at the earlier stages of their career, so from trainee through to associate level. And we work on increasing engagement on topics such as gender and support the Women's Network in that. And that's by putting on events such as the one today. And I'm really pleased to have three excellent panellists who have come to share their views on the role of both men and women in increasing and fostering gender equality and overcoming the obstacles to career progression for women. And it's very important to us that we have both men and women engaged on such a topic, and so we're working to better facilitate the engagement of both genders. And just before we continue, just some housekeeping. So if there is a fire alarm, we're hoping there won't be. The fire exit is just outside on the left, just as you exit this room. Okay, so I'll be starting by asking the panellists a few questions, and then I'll hand over to the audience to ask their own questions. And before I do so, I'll just hand over to the panellists now to introduce themselves.
Would you like me to start?
Yes,
I have no idea if this microphone is working as a microphone, is it? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, fine. I'm quite loud anyway, so I don't know whether that's a microphone or just my voice. But hi everybody, thank you Shanice. My name's Scarlett Brown. As you can see, I think my face is behind me, which is slightly disconcerting. I'm a senior governance analyst at Grant Thornton, which is not technically the reason I'm here today. But that's my kind of day job. And then I've also just completed a PhD at King's looking at how men and women are appointed onto boards of directors. And that kind of stems from a background in studying diversity and inclusion, and looking at kind of barriers and facilitators to women's progression throughout organisations.
Thank you. I'm Cressida Pollock. I also have my photo behind me, and I agree it's disconcerting. So I have quite a long route actually, and I'm on to my fourth career. I actually started as I'm a paper barrister, so I qualified but did not practice, and then I left the law for finance and spent several years in finance working for an investment fund, and went from there to business school. And after business school I went to McKinsey, the management consulting firm, and through my work at McKinsey I got involved with English National Opera, which is an opera company. It's 85 years old in London. It's based now at the London Coliseum, where it's been for 49 years. And English National Opera is one of the most creative and exciting large-scale opera companies in London. We sing in English and we present work as sort of total theatre. I joined just over 2 years ago as a turnaround CEO, and I'm pleased to say it's going well and we are stable, which is always nice. And I'm really looking forward to bringing a bit of perspective from both McKinsey and obviously from the arts to today's discussion.
Brilliant. Where do we get memberships?
Absolutely. Ask me for details afterwards.
Okay.
Freddie, I'm signing you up.
Hi everybody, my name is Freddie Alves and my photograph is behind Scarlett. After a first career which was exploring for oil and gas in various parts of the world, 20 years ago in March this year I moved into the field of inclusion and diversity. And so I've been doing this work both inside organisations in many different sectors, as well as working on inclusion and diversity as a consultant throughout that time. I now work for a consultancy called Talking Talent, and we provide a lot of support to organisations who are looking to improve the gender balance that they have in their pipeline. And my specific focus is around inclusion, how you create it, how you measure it, and how you help leaders understand what the behaviours and practices are that create it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. It's just so great to have such varied panellists here today with us. So my first question is, what do you all see as the main obstacles to women thriving in their careers?
It's going to be me first all day, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Sat on the wrong side. Sure, I'll go first for the first one then. I mean, first of all, I think I like the use of the word thrive in this context. I think that it's really important that conversations about the sorts of things we're hopefully going to cover today don't kind of focus too much on just about progression and just about getting to the top. I think there's also a conversation to be had about having jobs that we want to have and that make us thrive and that make us feel good about ourselves and that mean that we can kind of get the best sense of and actually have productive workers as well. So I think for me, I just wanted to kind of start by saying that it's not just about being at the top, it's about making sure your job is making you thrive in a lot of ways. I think for me, the main obstacle has to be a kind of the structural lack of change. I think that there's been a lot of change in women's ambition. I think there's been a lot of change in women's progression. And I think that there's been a lot of ways that actually the structures and the way that we work hasn't necessarily caught up with that. That would be my kind of overarching answer. I'm sure I'll go into the details as we go along.
So I thought a lot about a sort of theme I think you'll hear from me a bit today is about informal networks. And one of the great challenges is not just what do I do in my career, but as Scarlett just said, you know, how do I get the job I want? How do I match that? How do I even know it's available? How do I progress? How do I find, especially for many in this room who I believe are training solicitors, yep, good. You'll be thinking, which area of practice do I want to go into? How am I going to develop that practice? Is there a specialty I want to go into? And I think, certainly in my experience, you know, the networks available and the sort of understanding of how to utilize those networks, which aren't necessarily formal. It's not necessarily your supervisor. It's not necessarily your boss. It's how to approach people and build that network and start the conversations to understand what's available. What are your opportunities? What interests you need to have? You know, how do you manage to find out that there's a project going on or something you're interested in, and actually how do I get involved in that? And certainly in my experience, actually, we'll come back to the arts later on, but certainly at McKinsey and in finance was that those networks, despite the best attempts in a way of, you know, women's networks, which have just been amazing, and I highly recommend going to all women's network events you can, but there just still isn't that feeling of, oh, yes, actually, why don't you come and help me out on this project, and finding those conversations. And partly that's because at women's networks often you've got the senior women in the room and there aren't as many senior women. So you don't know, and they might be specific in areas, but we can come back to that. But that for me is utilizing a network, how to navigate an informal network is, I think, a serious sort of obstacle, and one which actually can be changed.
Okay, thank you. So for me, the main block or the main obstacle is really a lack of inclusive leaders and a lack of inclusive cultures, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means as we go. And although I've worked across many sectors in the last 20 years, I think that's a common theme, that the fundamental challenge to make sure that both women and men can thrive and be successful in any of those organizations. And I agree, whether that means moving vertically up through an organization or just having the joy of doing a job that you love for as long as you want to and do it in the way that you want to. The heart of that is how we create an inclusive culture that supports both women and men and helps them be able to thrive. And there's a challenge. Maybe if you think about the words diversity inclusion consultant, I might not be the first person that comes to your mind. But actually, I play an important role because I represent many of the people who are still at the heart of the decision making in business today, both around talent and around the way business culture operates. And I will never forget when I first started inclusion and diversity work, I had two fantastic women colleagues in the same group who asked me many questions about what I thought life was like in the oil industry for women. And the amount of eye rolling that went on as I gave them answers made me realize very quickly that I had no clue that their lived experience was radically different from mine. And that's a key thing to learn, is that as we help leaders become more inclusive, we need to be willing to meet them wherever they are and help them gently but persuasively to understand what it's going to take to create a more inclusive culture. Because I think an inclusive culture, yes, it is about policies, and actually in our research, flexibility, we surveyed 2,500 women a couple of years ago about barriers to careers. Their number one ask was for more flexibility. So yes, it is about policy. More importantly, I think it's about support for managers, from managers, and that was the number two ask after flexibility from the women we surveyed was, I just need more support from my direct manager. And it's about the overall culture, the kind of norms, the practices and the behaviours that set the tone in the entire organisation. And who largely creates that culture? You know the answer to that question, right? It's the leaders at the middle and senior levels. They're the people who set the tone, who hold the norms and practices that the behaviour and the behaviours that drive the company. So I always remember the lessons that I needed to learn from those colleagues of mine to try to understand and become more sensitive to their needs and the things that would create an organisation that was sufficiently inclusive for them to thrive in as well.
Thank you. And we see the lack of senior women in so many different organisations, and that often seems to be partly because the women avoid entering in the first place in sectors such as STEM, so we have science, technology, engineering and maths. So they avoid entering into these areas, and then once they get into these areas, they don't aim to thrive to the top because some people have said that they don't have the same ambitions as men. So how do we, number one, encourage women to demand recognition and thrive to the top? And number two, to enter these areas where there's such a huge shortage? You can start with Chrissy there.
Perfect. So I'm actually, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to not talk about STEM because I'm going to leave the panel side of me to talk about STEM. I'm actually going to talk about something I've really observed in the arts. So the arts is seen, as I was saying to Freddie, I mean, it's the arts. We must be the most inclusive thing ever, right? We're tolerant, we're diverse. I mean, it's actually not true, but that's what everyone seems to think in the arts. And something which really fascinated me is I went round the Roundhouse. Do you all know what the Roundhouse is? So I went round the Roundhouse, which is amazing, with Marcus Davey, who is the most incredible CEO there. And he's done, one of the things he's done is he's created these recording studios, which you can rent out for, say, it's something like £5 an hour, for effectively children, well, young people in the main, to come and make recordings and to sort of develop work and develop in music and be engaged. And they've been immensely successful. And I asked him when he took me round what percentage of those booths, you know, and I went round every single booth we saw, where it was, I think, a middle of a Friday that I was there, and they were all filled with people making music, and, you know, mainly, you know, on the sort of, I would call the popular music side from opera, but mainly that side of things, but everything across the spectrum there. And there wasn't a single woman in a single one of those booths. And I was like, what are you doing about this? And I really challenged him on it, because Marcus is renowned for his work on that. And actually, you know, so we talk about STEM, but I also look at it when you look at the number of, you know, if you even look at the number of singers and groups that come through, the number of music groups who come through who are, you know, the blokes who played together. I thought of this again when I went to a brilliant exhibition. I absolutely recommend the Pink Floyd exhibition at the V&A last week. And it's an amazing exhibition. And I took my colleague, who's a big Pink Floyd Anorak fan, and he said to me, I can't believe that this wasn't, you know, you weren't as into this when you were younger. And I said, well, you know, I had friends who were all into it, but there wasn't a single woman in that world. Like, there's not, you know, throughout this entire exhibition, which was extremely comprehensive, there was one woman whose name appeared once as having done some of the artwork, and that was it. And so you look at that and you say, it's not just STEM, it's actually certain parts of the creative industry which still don't allow for people to say, you know, actually, I'm 17 years old, or, you know, one of you, and you're a trained citizen, you say, actually, I really love making music, and actually, I'm going to get together and go do some recording sessions just for fun. You know, it's not that expensive. People don't do that. Is it because it's a social cachet? Is it because, and I think that applies to STEM as well, is it because, you know, there are so few women doing it? How do you, you know, how are you not just the one girl in the band? You know, how is that role modelled on TV? So I wanted just to sort of divert a little back to that, not just on informal networks, but actually talk about the difficulties of why people feel I can't enter that. And in the arts, you certainly see it, where you have a lot more women in administration and doing fantastic jobs and leading organizations. But on the artistic leadership or even director side, there are, you know, it's changing, but there's just, you know, you put together a list of the sort of top 20 theatre directors in London, and there will now be women on them, and very successful women, but there still aren't that many. So again, but that is changing because you're getting those role models, because you've got people directing, you know, you've got people winning Olivier's for an all-female written show, which was Nell Gwyn, and that's actually a celebration of those collaborations. So I think that to some extent, the lack of those entering those sectors is not seeing enough role models and not then knowing, well, how do I get into that? Or I can read about this person and I discovered they did this, this and this. Oh, actually, I can follow that route, or even find out what that route looks like for me today. Which way am I going, Freddie?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I hope you'll forgive me, but I'm going to keep ploughing the same furrow on inclusive culture and inclusive leadership, because I have to say, in the last 5 years, I've begun to realize more and more and more strongly that we have not been successful at engaging the group of people in organizations who we absolutely have to affect and change if we're going to get systemic cultural change, and that's middle and senior level leaders, many of whom are men, some of whom are women, of course. And what my focus is how you help people who have one lived experience of what it's like to be in a business, whatever sector that's in. They've maybe worked in a fairly homogeneous group and they found that the ways that they do things have always worked well for them, and they have a sense of, well, that should work well for everybody, right? And my challenge to myself and to all of us as we think about how to create cultures where more women can thrive is, it's not going to be about changing policies, although that can help. Flexibility, parental leave policies, they can certainly help. It's not going to be about providing targeted learning opportunities for women. That can help, it certainly does. Fundamentally, it's going to be around creating inclusive cultures. We know the behaviors that help leaders create an inclusive culture. We know how to measure inclusion, and from my perspective, that's really what we have to focus on, is engaging the senior leaders, and especially the men, in the behaviors and the practices that will make gender inclusive cultures. As long as we avoid that, because it sometimes feels uncomfortable, I swear we will not make the progress we need to make and that we all want to see made. So it's very much for me about leadership, and I think we now have very practical ways to help leaders understand how they can create inclusion, and it's simply having the opportunity to engage people in that conversation and give them practical support and help. What doesn't help, though, is that when we come across all judgmental, right? Sometimes when you hear the phrase unconscious bias, guess what the first reaction is for many senior men when they hear that phrase unconscious bias? Here we go again. I'm going to be judged. I'm told I'm a bad person. No, let's take them through a journey around inclusion, and I think we can persuade many more men to become advocates for gender balance. And that's really what we need to accelerate the progress.
Yeah, I agree. I do agree. I think I was, when I was thinking about this question, sat on a number of panels and similar to this, and I always flinch, a little bit like the men that you just talked about. I flinch when I hear about women not being ambitious enough, because I just don't, that's just not what I see with the women that I speak to. I speak to a lot of incredibly ambitious women, and I think women are very ambitious, but they're just also not stupid, and going for roles that you don't think you're going to get is a difficult thing to sort of persuade yourself that you want to do. I think, I mean, kind of reflecting on what you were just saying, Freddie, about kind of getting the men involved, I think my research that I've been doing for the last few years is kind of quite an interesting example of where this happens. So to kind of explain a little bit of the backstory, my research looked at how men and women try and get onto boards of directors, and I'm sure that you will have seen at some point in the last sort of 4 or 5 years there's been quite a huge focus on getting women onto boards, and the kind of women on boards review that the government went through, and for about the period of about 3 or 4 years it was all we could talk about. It was all that kind of got raised up. And so during that time I was doing research on men and women who were trying to get onto boards. Now what's really interesting about the Women on Boards agenda, or the Women on Boards initiative, is that it was run by a man, an ex-city banker, I think he was. He worked in the city. He was asked by the government to run this Women on Boards initiative, and he kind of spearheaded it. And it's interesting because there's a lot of kind of commentary that's come out since that says, you know, if it had been a woman running that agenda, then they don't think it would have got the same traction. He worked with some very important and very successful women, but ultimately it was headed up by a man. I think it's an interesting one for me because actually, because there was so much focus on getting women onto boards during that time, it then got to the point where actually FTSE 100 boards, FTSE 250 boards had so much pressure to get a woman on them that the women I would speak to were constantly talking about getting onto these boards. And for me, I think that's really interesting because these are some of the biggest companies in the world. So these women do not lack ambition at all. But again, they're going for the roles that they believe there might be a way into. So up until then, there wasn't a lot of things. So I think it is exactly, that's what made me think about it with Cressida saying that actually it's about role models, but again, I shy away from the word role models because I think that particularly for millennial women, there's an issue with quite often seeing women in senior roles and not necessarily being able to identify with the way that they got there. But I think evidence that women can get to places is incredibly important. And actually seeing people in those roles and saying, I don't think I would get to it in the same way, I might not identify with her, but the fact that she is there means that maybe I will be able to get there. Because, and as I found with my research, in comparison to, there's, you know, as you will know from working with clients, there's a huge number of organisations and companies that are not the FTSE 250 and the FTSE 100, who weren't under an immense amount of pressure to get women onto their boards, and the women were not trying to get onto those boards, you know. So I think there's something in there about ambition is crafted by where we think we can get to, and if we think we can get there, the ambition goes through the roof.
Thank you. And just do feel free to respond to anything that your colleagues have said, or panellists have said. But my next question is, can you give us an example, so I'm just delving into your personal experience now, an example of something that's stood out as having helped your career progression or the woman that you've worked with or carried out research on?
Yeah.
This
is my turn, right? Yet again, I might take a slight left turn here. Because I come from a kind of science and technology background, I guess I grew up always feeling that the way you gain support for action was facts, right? In fact, I was once asked to evaluate the sale of an oil field in the North Sea. It was the crown jewel of the company I was working for at the time. Initially, I was told, Freddie, don't worry about it. This thing is far too valuable. We'll never sell it. But I ran the numbers anyway. And a month later, I found myself having the terrifying experience of sitting in front of the CEO while he went line by line through my cash flow analysis. Sure enough, it was worth nearly 100 million more to somebody else because of a tax wrinkle, and we sold it. The lesson I learned was, if you've got the right data and the right facts, you can persuade people to change. And I don't think it's any different when it comes to the field of inclusion and diversity, because there are still plenty of leaders out there across organisations, whether we like it or not, who are deeply sceptical that there are barriers to progression for women, or for anybody else, come to that matter. And I've often found myself in discussions with senior leaders, especially men, saying, when I ask them why were so few women or no women promoted last year into senior level? Oh, it was a really unusual year, Freddie. The women just weren't quite ready this time. Then, if you can put together and show them the 5-year pattern that says, how come this hasn't happened at any point in the last 5 years, then that's a really different conversation. And it's one where you actually have an actionable insight that you can take to a leader and say, this is a problem we have to fix together. It's not like I'm throwing it at them as a judgment, but what I've learned is one of the ways to help leaders overcome some of this natural skepticism and this lack of recognition about what some of the barriers to people who are not like themselves are, data is really important. So for any of you who are involved in employee networks, any of you who are engaged in trying to be convincing with senior leaders in your organisation, do try and work at getting some of those actionable insights together, because without them you can't have the kind of powerful, mind-changing conversations that you need to have with, like we said earlier, the very people who are driving the culture and making a lot of the key talent decisions. So I just think it makes sense when you're trying to persuade leaders to become part of the change process that you can help them understand what's broken and then help them fix it.
Oh, yeah, we're going
Sure.
in a circle. I like it.
So I mean, on a personal level, things that have helped me, I think, we'll talk about this a little bit later anyway, but I think sponsorship was a really big deal for me, having people who would put me forward for things, getting a good mentor who is prepared to actually put you forward for things and advocate for you things, who is prepared to tell you things that you don't want to hear. I had a lot of criticism when I first started doing my PhD that my appearance wasn't professional enough, and my supervisor made me go through appearance coaching, and I hated her for it because I was offended and annoyed, but she pushed me forward and put me forward for things a lot. So I think actually finding somebody who's going to be a good sponsor from a very personal level, I agree kind of with Freddie in that there's a lot to be done structurally. But I think in terms of things that helped me, having a sponsor was really important. And I think don't be afraid to go out and find a man to be your sponsor, because I think women in senior roles have got enough on their plate at the moment. And I think there's a huge expectation and pressure placed on women to help all the other women underneath her. And there's a lot of us underneath her kind of asking for time. So actually some of the biggest sponsors and mentors in my life have definitely been men as well. And actually I think when I was thinking about this, when I was thinking that actually as well as just the people that you work with or that are above you, but I think actually the women that I speak to, the women I interviewed, my previous research was also on maternity leave, and actually for some of the women coming, the person who would help them most would be a colleague or a PA who would send them things and update them with things, and actually having somebody who's in your corner can be really important. And actually the more I thought about that, I was thinking just a more general thing, that you cannot be expected to do it alone. You can't think that your progression and that your success is going to be just because of how hard you worked. For me, I was thinking about it was the people that sponsored me, it was the people that supported me, it's having supportive friends, having partners that maybe want to help you raise your children rather than expecting you to do it will be a really big factor. So actually I think there's everybody's got a squad behind them and somebody pushing them forward, and for me it's definitely that. You've got to get a good squad, because otherwise there's no way you're going to make it to the end.
So I was thinking of sort of a few stories to share, actually. I've got too big a selection. I funny enough did some work at McKinsey in offshore oil, and it was a restructuring organisation. There was a redundancy process, and I was disappointed that every woman who had started out as potential for redundancy ended up being made redundant. And I continually heard the same conversation, which was, well, they don't get on with people. They're a bit hard to get along with. Whereas the men who are like that, and this is offshore oil to be fair, said, yes, but they're just tough, and fair enough, but they're very good otherwise. And it's really hard, especially when your sample size is only like 2 women in the group in the first place. It's very hard to say, hang on, there's a pattern here. But again, it's going to year after year after year. I talked a bit about networks. I was going to talk about networks on mentors for what helped me. Because I'm going to admit, sort of upfront, it's taken me a really long time to understand what a mentor is, how to use a mentor, and how to find a mentor. For years I've been told mentors are important. And I was like, I don't know how to find this person. I don't know how to approach this person. Who is this mythical person who will help me guide my entire career progression? Because that's what I've got to find, and that's going to be what I need. And then on informal networks, I thought of a story here. I was at McKinsey, and there was a really interesting piece of research being done on crisis management, which was an area I was really interested in. And one of my colleagues who started with me was chatting to me about it, and he's like, oh yeah, so I've been asked to sort of do some extra work on it, and I'm working with this director on it, and it was a really important director, and they were sort of building this network. And I was a bit sort of miffed, and I thought, God, I didn't even know this was available. I was like, well, how did you hear about it? And he's like, oh, because we play in the football team on like Thursdays together. And I thought, oh, I get this. And the opportunities to have those conversations, to have those meetings. And I think it also hurts in flexible working. We were just talking about that earlier, which is flexible working is possible, but it automatically also does take you out of, Friday lunchtimes and, water cooler conversations and corridor conversations and, potentially events like this. And that can be more damaging than you realize. So So using informal networks is important. When I started at McKinsey, a friend of mine who started with me, he's a very good friend, I honestly couldn't believe how good he was at networking. Like, he just seemed, I was like, how do you have these conversations? How have you built these relationships? What is the magic formula? Am I just not built so that I have those conversations? Am I being too serious? Am I being not serious enough? Am I being, too sort of, tell me about your career? What are the opening conversations? And I think on senior levels, there's actually work you can do to try and encourage people to start opening up about what they want from their career. But I also advise anyone who is at that point, looking for networks and looking to say, oh, actually, there's a really interesting piece of research you're doing, and I'd love to, be your research assistant or something like that on it. That actually, you need to be willing, try and find out. Actually, use your networks. Be unashamed to ask. To say, actually, how do I do this? I really regret that I didn't go see this director who'd done the crisis management bit and say, I've heard you're doing this. I'd really like to be involved. I was too embarrassed. I was like, I can't do this. I've never met this person. And I should have just gone on.
I also really love, sorry, can I jump in with Cressida, that, and I see this all the time with, because I interview men and women about their progression quite a lot, and I love that you went straight into what I see all the time with women, which is like, I can't do it, what if I do it wrong, like I'm saying it wrong, like everything I say is going to come out wrong, like the men and women I speak to, very, very, very senior business leaders, and I speak to women who are running companies who will still have that conversation about like, I don't know if I can network, like what if I'm too forward, what if I'm too pushy, what if I'm not pushy enough. None of the men are having that internal monologue and stressing about whether or not they're too pushy. They just aren't. And I don't want to spend too much time being like men are from Mars and women are from Venus. But at that level, when it comes to the networking, it's that kind of relaxedness, and they're like, well, we just chatted to this guy, and then he said, and then he put me on his board, and it was fine. And I'm like,
I'm going to say something a little controversial.
We're only halfway through.
Which is. Bluntly, one of the things I think women think about more than men who are junior think about is, are they going to think that this is an inappropriate flirtation? And I'm just going to say that out there and say, none of my male friends seem to have ever thought that question. There are stories I know, particularly in for gay senior men and gay younger men, where there's undoubtedly been, that happens. People have relationships at work. All of these things happen. But I think especially in a situation where you don't have that many senior women, so you're like, we're going to get on because we share ovaries, is always a bit of a difficult thing. And then when you're finding...
You share them.
It's 2017.
We both have ovaries, thank you. But also... I'm going to be really upfront and say, there have been moments when you're like, oh God, I'm talking to this person at drinks, and drinks have been going on for a couple of hours, and we're all a couple of glasses of wine in, and, someone then says, also it can be your colleague can say to you afterwards, oh, you were totally flirting with that partner. And you just feel absolutely like horrified, and you think, oh my God, I can never talk to them again, and I don't know what I did. And it is actually quite a difficult thing to navigate. And on mentors, so talking about mentors who've been helpful for me, especially as you progress in your career, I'm actually going to say your mentors aren't necessarily senior to you. I'm having a lot of conversations at the moment with friends who are absolutely brilliant and incredibly successful women, and they're all between either first or second child. And there are a lot of conversations in my life about whether people are going back to work, whether they're going for partner in law firms, how can they go for flexible working, what's their career plan. Get tactical. Don't just talk about how hard it is, actually get tactical. Use friends in different industries to talk about what their strategies are. Actually have that conversation with mentors. Remember, you also have a huge survivorship bias. The senior women in your industries, they did stay. So they will always say, oh, well, I did this. And it might be they had a supportive partner, or they had lots of money and could have 2 nannies, or, they struggled endlessly. There's all of these different ways to have that conversation. I have a couple of great mentors from McKinsey who've been amazing. One of the things they've often done for me learning about that they were mentors was most of the time we just, gossip about life and, how things are. But every now and again they'll just say, actually, no, this is, what do you even talk about? This is what you need, and give me that advice. I have some great male mentors as well, particularly through E&O. And I'm going to keep citing McKinsey because actually I kept a lot of mentors from McKinsey when I went to E&O, and they've been amazing. But even when I went for E&O, which is a really complicated story, which we don't have time to get into, but effectively they were in complete crisis and they needed a CEO. And one of my mentors at McKinsey was like, well, why don't you go for CEO? And I was like, God, no, there's no way I'm qualified, like, haha, whatever. And I was trying to take a secondment from McKinsey to E&O to be head of strategy for a year, which McKinsey had agreed to and E&O had agreed to, and then the chairman and the CEO resigned and everything went into crisis. And actually it was a senior partner at McKinsey who I knew, and I talked to her at one point about leaving the firm and what I might do. And I said, I looked at something like this, and she went, what the hell are you talking about? You're applying for CEO roles, you can totally do this. And it was her saying that, I still can't believe she said it, but her saying that made me think, oh, if this comes up in this conversation about E&O, I could totally say yes. So it really was having someone say, actually, this is how you can develop and how you get there.
Right, thank you. And before we go on to more...
Can I just make one comment?
Yeah, sure.
Because both Scarlett and Cressida mentioned mentoring and sponsorship. And I think there's one really important piece of research that says that compared to men, women are over-mentored and under-sponsored.
Well, I wrote one. I wrote a piece.
You wrote that piece? So why don't you
I know. I mean,
explain?
I actually jumped into it. It was written by a fantastic American academic called Hermina Ibarra, who wrote the piece about mentors and sponsors. But I found it also in my research looking. So I did write a piece called "Women Are Over-Mentored and Sponsored." So, but yes, I mean, and that is exactly what it found. Is that, and I found in my research as well, is that women would have all these mentors, people who were perhaps an official mentor or an unofficial mentor, who would say, yeah, you should go for that. Yeah, you should go for that. Yep, you should definitely go for that. As you say, sometimes when it comes in the right minute, it can be exactly what you need to hear. But in comparison, the men I was speaking to, they didn't say they had somebody saying you should go for that. They had somebody calling them up and saying, my mate's got this job and I think you'd be really good for it. I'm going to put in a good word for you. Yeah. And actually, it's having people who are prepared to pick up the phone and call somebody else and recommend you. That is what a sponsor is. Or who is prepared to say, I've spoken to my friend who is an image consultant and she's going to give you a free session. Or something, that is a sponsor. And actually that's, I think, answering again to Cressida's point about what is a mentor. Having somebody you can have a quick catch-up conversation with every 6 months and get some guidance is a good thing, but you have to build a strong enough relationship with whoever it is. And they don't have to be more senior than you, again, like you say.
And actually, I might, if I can, just give a quick example on this. So one of my very old friends, we went to school together and university, I know her a long time, was thinking about what was next in her career. She's between first and second children and she has quite an intense job, and she said, I was thinking about it. And I sat her down and said, whatever you do, before, if you decide to take a break from career, etc., join some boards. And this is about being tactical. I said, join a couple of boards, join an arts board, join 2 charitable boards, because that will keep you a network, it will keep you involved in something, and it will give, something for you to talk about if you decide to take 5 years out. And it was really interesting because I then said, right, what are you interested in the arts? And actually, I called the chairman that I knew of a board of something she was interested in, and I said, I have this incredible person, you need to talk to them. They have this, and this. And and then sent her resume over, he introduced them, and she's now on the board. And I really hope she enjoys it, because I feel quite responsible. But she was just like, I can't. She was so grateful, and she sent me so many messages saying thank you so much. I'm going to admit it. If she was in London and liked opera, I would have been like, you're joining my board. She was amazing. She's the most qualified person I could suggest for a board. The chairman of the relevant arts board is literally sent me so many thank you emails, being like, oh my God, this is amazing. We've apart from anything else, lowered the average age of our board by about 20 years just with her addition. And that's the thing. Even for your peers, you can be that advocate for change, and you can help with those connections as well.
Great. So it's really good to hear about the positive examples. I think it's important to also talk about what doesn't work. So in your experience, what have been diversity and inclusion strategies that you have seen that have been the least helpful, just not successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, so I mean, to go back to the women on board stuff, because that's kind of where I sit, I think to kind of more to put some maybe more negative or some more critical angles on the same things, I think there are always going to be the risk of backlash to things, particularly things like the Women on Boards agenda, where there was so much focus on it, and actually a lot of the women, or particularly a lot of the men that I would speak to, would constantly tell me that it's now, oh, I haven't got a role because I'm a man. The one was told by a headhunter, if you wore a skirt, I could get you into any boardroom you like. Which I really like, because I was like, well, put on a skirt then.
Yeah,
What's wrong with you? But actually, the number of men I would speak to during my research who would tell me that they hadn't been successful because they weren't a woman, and I had to bite my tongue, or at least tell them very kind of calmly that during the period of time when the number of women on boards doubled, 7 out of 10 new roles went to men. Still only. So women still only got 3 out of 10 during that period of time. And having to kind of say to men, do you maybe think it's the other men that you're up against that are getting the roles rather than the men in skirts or the women? So I think that it's not so much that it didn't work, but I'm concerned and I'm very sceptical, particularly when it comes to the Women on Boards agenda, particularly because it was so fast and so quick and so focused on a tiny, tiny issue that they changed the number, and now there has been, everything's gone kind of quiet and the numbers have stagnated, and the guy who was in charge of the programme has run away with his success and his glory, and now it's going to kind of, there hasn't been sort of long-term change. So I think, to kind of go back to the initial point I said, is that I think that the successful ones are ones where we see actual long-term structural, cultural change. Not let's just fix this one thing, let's just give the company a women's network and then not give them any money to support it, or let's just appoint another 10 women and then that's us job done. So it's more of a broader thing, a significant one. But.
So I was really thinking about this question beforehand. One of the things I see a lot in the arts is the same people get asked to be on the same boards. So particularly in non-profit, there's so ethnic diversity as well as gender diversity is a big topic. There are basically sort of 3 ethnically diverse women who also have experience in fundraising who basically get sort of rotate through all the arts boards, and they're phenomenal women. But there's also this aspect of we're also putting, again, it comes back to networks, but putting in the networks, who gets recommended, who has people heard of it, where is that pipeline coming from? And I think one of the difficult things as well, even from the discussion, which has been brought up, I think, by both Freddie and Scarlett today, is there's a level of seniority one assumes one needs to achieve here. It's like my friend who I put on this arts board, she's 34. It's not that she is, absolutely senior in her career or has reached that level of, pomp and ceremony. There are lots of different boards for people to be on, and we focus, as Scarlett said, on the sort of FTSE 100 and 250, but we're not necessarily focusing on like local schools, local communities, your local arts institution, even local businesses, and actually what impact you can have there and how to get involved. So I think that I've seen, and I think that's one other thing I was just going to add as well. I have also talked a lot about how to succeed, not just thrive. And I think it's worth us. I think the challenge I often find with sort of diversity and inclusion strategies on gender is the role modelling is really done by, and back to role modelling, the people you have to come and talk are the ones who are, you look at and say, oh wow, they're exceptionally successful, and therefore that's, if I want to do that, I want to do, that's the track I'm going down. And it's sort of, McKinsey always had, what the senior partners and directors were doing, and which were the women there, without actually talking about overall retention rate of women at every single level of the organisation. Flexible working at every single level. I'm going to be really blunt and say flexible working when you're really senior is just difficult. It really is. If you're a CEO, whether you're male or female, you're working, usually, 80 hours a week, and that's just that's just what that job involves. It's a responsibility, it's a pressure. So flexible working is like, oh, could I work 65? It's always a challenge there. But actually, we tend to look at it from how senior women have made it, or, you know, we don't necessarily focus enough in diversity inclusion on mid-management, but also just the people who say, actually, you know, what's the flexibility like for everyone's assistants? You know, there is an aspect there as well.
Where does diversity and inclusion strategy not work? Where it's not strategic, where it's not looking at cultural change, where it's not trying to get at the deep-seated issues, where it becomes tick the box. So there are a lot of organizations out there still today with leaders who feel some peer pressure. They see things happening in other organizations and they say, I better spend some money and get some people to spend a bit of time to at least show that we're taking some action. So as an example, unconscious bias training. Unconscious bias training can be fantastically successful if it's linked to a specific challenge the business is facing. So if you know that too few women are being promoted, you focus your unconscious bias training on exactly that problem, not just some generic individual learning that people leave and say, well, that was interesting, but I haven't got a clue what to do with it. Another tick the box is where people set up employee networks. I've actually had a senior leader quite recently say, well, the challenge is for the women, Freddie, so why wouldn't I just set up a women's network and let them come up with a solution? They could come up with some solutions, but the real conversation was, what's your role going to be as a senior leader? Or it's about, let's recruit more women. I actually had a leader who said, we've got this big problem with voluntary attrition, but I could get over it by just recruiting 3 times as many women. And then I'll end up with the right number. Rather than saying, for goodness sake, let's fix the culture. Let's make sure we've got an inclusive culture where women want to stay and thrive. So I think for me, where it all goes wrong is when people jump into action because they're feeling pressure of some kind from inside or out. They don't think through structurally and from a cultural standpoint, what are we trying to achieve? And they just tick a few boxes and hope that's going to keep them out of trouble. And of course it won't.
Thank you. And just moving swiftly on, just I want us to
Yeah.
have some time for audience questions. So I'll just ask a few more. So what kind of change in behaviour and actions do you think we have seen from men and need to continue seeing from men to foster gender equality in the workplace?
To me?
So,
Yep.
let's
start.
So I use an inclusive leadership assessment with managers, and I think that's quite important, but it has nearly 40 items in it, because we know what creates feelings of inclusion. If you're a leader and you're trying to create inclusion, you have to do 2 things. You have to make people feel it's safe to be a unique individual, that you don't have to cover up anything about yourself when you come to work. So it's about being unique, but it's also about having that sense of belonging, that everybody has a similar sense of belonging to the organisation. So cut the story short, if I could only ask 2 questions and have 2 behaviours, they're this. I want to know that my manager cares about me as an individual, and I want a manager who makes it safe to speak up. If you get even those 2 things right, you're already a long way down the track to creating an inclusive culture. Because let's remember, most excluding behaviour is unintentional, right? When I do workshops and I ask people to vote on that, 90% usually, people say 90% of excluding behaviour is unintentional. So the key to building inclusive cultures is to make it safe for people to give one another feedback. So you want a manager who cares about you as an individual, and you want a manager who's making it safe to speak up. If you get those 2 things, you're starting well down the road to creating inclusion.
You know, I think I can only just agree that. It's the ability to speak up, not that you have to, not that you need to always, but just the ability to say, actually, this is something I'm not comfortable with, or, you know, actually, I still remember at McKinsey, when it just started, and one of my senior managers said, "Oh, you were so girly about that." And I said, "Oh, I actually find that really offensive." And first of all, I don't like that you'd use the word girl as a pejorative description. And secondly, then I didn't like that you applied it to me. And they said, "Oh, why would you say girly is pejorative?" Which is always the answer you get. And like, no, you absolutely did just, it's exactly the same as, "Oh, that was so gay." Which is, I think, had a lot greater discussion and acceptance. And it's a bit like saying, "Well, you are gay, so why should I say that's so gay?" And that's a problem. And I actually, I had this manager I spoke up to, and he still actually meets up and we still catch up. But it was really hard, and he wasn't particularly happy about it. And he felt a bit like, "Are you accusing me of being sexist?" And I was like, "No, I'm actually just giving you some guidance." And just like a signpost to say that actually can be, it's like, my other favourite one is, I've been called smart cookie, and I'm always like, so many times, it's what I call benevolent sexism. I actually even had that conversation with my chairman, who, please, if you ever meet him, do not tell him that I wrote this out loud. But my chairman is amazing. But once we had a conversation, I was like, "I'm going to sit you down and talk to you about what benevolent sexism is." And he was really upset. Happily, he went home and he asked his daughter, who's actually exactly my age and amazing and an incredible theatre producer, and you should all go see her, Alice Underground at the Vaults, which she produced at the moment. And she was like, "Yeah, Dad, you totally are." Which I hadn't prepped her to say, but was really helpful. It's a really difficult conversation to have. And, you also think, well, I'm not given coaching on how to give this feedback. I don't really know how to say, calling me a smart cookie, I find offensive because actually I'm not a sweet baked goat.
Not 12.
I know. But it happens. And then you always get the excuse, "Oh, well, it's just that it's from the era, it's a different era. You've got to appreciate Cressida, they're from a different era." And I'm not offended. I completely understand that it was well intentioned. I know they're trying to compliment me. I'm just trying to say, like, in the same way I'd be cautious of my language, please can you be cautious of yours? So it's also helping people to, and actually if you're a male leader and you get given that conversation, and you find it really uncomfortable and doesn't go well, don't just be like, "Oh, this was ridiculous." Actually then have a conversation about how they could have told you about it in a better way, because that actually might be really helpful as well. Actually maybe just saying to my chairman, "You're being a benevolent sexist," which I was really stressed about saying, because after he'd introduced me for like the 4th time, and it was just not good. And I could have had that conversation in a better way, but the problem is it's a really scary conversation to have.
I don't know if I can add anything much to both of those. I was thinking about the kind of how can we persuade it? That was the question, right? How can we persuade men to sort of get part of it? I think for me, what we're kind of touching on here is it has to be a strategic conversation. People have to believe in it, which is kind of a more difficult sell. I think we're lucky in the sense that we've got to the stage where arguing why diversity is important we've come a long way in the last sort of 40, 50 years on that. I think I'm always sceptical of any time somebody's like, "We have to because it's a business imperative, it's a business case, we have to do that because diversity will mean that we'll be more productive in this way." I'm deeply sceptical of a business case because I just think it has to be about more about social justice and about creating organisations that we want to work in, rather than because it's going to make the company more money, which is doesn't really make any sense. So I think it has to be a strategic conversation, and exactly as you say, I think those who can up need to be able to speak up, and those who don't feel they can speak up need to know how to get there or who to speak to on a very kind of broad scale. So depending on which side of that coin you fit into, depending on which way you have to go.
Thank you. So I'd just now like to hand over to the audience. If you do have any questions, please just raise your hand and Rosie will feed to you with the microphone. She's still in the room? No? Okay, you'll just have to speak up. Just raise your hand.
We've got microphones on.
There's a microphone now, right?
There is one there.
Yeah, there's one here as well.
Just one over here.
There's one here.
We've got one just to my right.
I can show. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I had a question for Scarlett. You said that you had been given feedback about your appearance and having to see an image consultant.
Yeah.
I'm just quite interested about what the rationale was, or why you felt that would be a benefit to you.
Yeah, It's a long story, which I write about in one of my chapters and can send you. It's, long story short, when I started doing my PhD, I would have been 22. I grew up in a very artistic, hippie household, to very hippie parents, and until the age of nearly, at least early 20s, didn't even own a suit, let alone how to wear one. And when I started doing the PhD, I had a very strong background in diversity and inclusion, very strong academic background, but had never, surprisingly enough, been in a boardroom. And my supervisor and the search firm, as in the executive search firm, who partnered with my PhD when they recruited me, said that although they were convinced that I could do the work itself, they weren't wholly convinced by my professional appearance. Which again, I write at length about how angry that made me at the time and still kind of does. But I think the easiest way that I can find to rationalise it is that I had 6 months to get ready to do the research, which involved interviewing very, very senior men and women, and I was a representative of my organisation, and therefore they had to kind of believe that I could go out and talk to very, very senior men and women. And effectively what happened is that I went through, in the space of 2 months, what I think every woman in this room would have gone through in the first few years of them joining a professional organisation, which is learning what outfits you can wear and what outfits you can't. My supervisor's done research on this, I think actually in a law firm and also in a accountancy firm. The conversations that she'd have with young women in their sort of early 20s particularly, where they would say, you know, we don't have any problem with sexism in our organisation, I don't feel like I have to work harder for being a woman. And then 5 minutes later we'll talk about how, you know, they would never wear a white shirt and a black skirt, because if you wear a white shirt and a black skirt then you might get mistaken for being a waitress or for being the person who makes the tea. And I'm sure that there is not a single woman in this room that doesn't have in the back of her head rules about what she can wear and what she can't wear with certain clients and certain people. The difference is that I had a professional telling me to my face that I have to wear blues and greys, and if I wear pinks and anything too baggy then I look too fancy, I look too young, and my hair has to be tied up, and I've got a long list of all the things that I have to do and say in order to be allowed to talk to people like you guys. But I don't think, and I don't say it with any victim narrative, because I know that every woman in this room has rules that they've already made for themselves about what they can and can't wear in professional environments. It's just that, yeah, somebody else told me mine.
I might just jump in on that. One of the fun things about going from Mackenzie to the arts is I basically get to wear whatever I want. It's really fun, but surprisingly difficult in the mornings. It made getting up in the mornings take a little bit longer. I think I have had situations where I've had to give feedback to women who worked for me about what they're wearing, and it is incredibly difficult to do, and it's very sensitive. You know, I think this is an interesting. It's sort of a parallel, because bluntly, I'm looking at the various men in the room actually, and effectively there is a uniform, and it's a very clear uniform, and it's a uniform which is immensely structured, and pretty much, you know, if you're smart, you've got a tie and a shirt. If you're deciding to go a bit more casual, you might just have the shirt, and then if you're really casual, you might put a sweater over the shirt rather than a jacket, right? That's about where the scope goes. And so this conversation for women is actually really complex, because to some extent we have a lot more choice. You know, you can wear a skirt or you can wear trousers. And we actually have a lot, you know, women won't get feedback on what they're wearing. Men will get feedback on any deviation much faster, actually, than women will get. They'll be told, you know, did you not shave today? You know, if you miss shaving for one day. And, you know, actually that's or you know, you can have organizations which say you just can't have a beard. You know, they're actually being told, men are being told what they can grow on their own faces, which is a natural occurrence. You know, can we just sort of think about actually that difference? And I think though it's such a sensitive issue for women about, and I think it's partly to do with the fact that there isn't a uniform for us in the same way. So there's also, so automatically there's a lot more personal choice and scope for personal choice that can go into that. And then that also then means I think it becomes much more personal, because you feel that it's a criticism of the personal choices you're making about yourself. But I just want to jump in and say, as women, it's also worth remembering that men can literally be told, I mean, can you imagine if we were told, you know, you must dye your hair so grey doesn't appear? Like, can you imagine if women were told that? But men are like, it's natural to have a beard, and if you choose to have one, and you should be able to. But I have known studies, for example, at McKinsey with certain clients where people have to not have a beard.
Yeah. I have a question on my right.
It was on the same
Been carrying talking about it for that.
It's a hornet's nest, this one.
Yeah, it is.
But some of the most painful conversations I've had have been with both women and men leaders who are saying, do you think I can give feedback to somebody about what they're wearing? And they really, really struggle with it. And the way I kind of look at it is, if this is something that's genuinely turning into a barrier to the professional contribution and success of that individual and the way that they're looked at in the organisation more broadly, I think you kind of have a responsibility
Absolutely.
to have that question, to have that conversation in the most sensitive way that you can.
Yeah.
And I have to say, it's always worth approaching saying, look, and you have to be blunt, that there are certain, you can sit in a room and you can see. I remember I was working with this brilliant analyst, and every time she talked in the room, people just took her less seriously than the brilliant male analyst working with me. And there was no reason, except for the fact that she dressed in a certain way. And she actually finally asked me about it. And she dressed completely inappropriately, but she naturally looked quite young. And, she was already fighting against that issue. And I think that is where you can have that conversation about what your work uniform is. I actually found looking at senior women and what they wore to be really helpful. I'm actually going to share the one great tip I was given, which I do use, I didn't use it today, which is the best way to look more senior is to wear a big necklace. And I'm serious. It can't be too dangly, but a big chunky necklace.
It can't be too dangly, and it can't be too floaty, and it can't be too much
dangly earrings.
But you get it right, then you'll be fine.
Dangly earrings will make you look younger,
Yeah.
but a chunky necklace, and I actually swear by this. Every time I do a press conference, I turn up with a necklace on. And I know it is one of those pieces of advice, but you know what? Own it and then use it tactically.
It's interesting because, the Centre for Talent Innovation, which does a lot of work on personal branding, right? One of the things they always say is dress for your next job. So you look just as you did at the people who are above, who are being successful, and think about, is there something I should be adopting to already be projecting the brand and the persona of that next level up in the organisation?
So we've just gone slightly over time, so one more question and then...
It's not so much a question, just kind of bouncing off what you were saying, because earlier you were saying the two things that will help women succeed or help encourage diversity and inclusion is for people to be able to thrive as an individual. And that's one of the things. And to be able to thrive as an individual, you should be able to wear pink if you want to and not have to wear blue. That's not going to affect how good you are at your job. And I think that it is more difficult with women and dressing at work because you need to look smart, and men have a uniform, and we don't have a set uniform. But I also think, it can be a freedom and it can be lovely, and there's a really important, I understand it's really important to look smart and professional, but at the same time, how is that line drawn when someone is told they can't wear a particular colour because they're not appearing super smart and professional at work? That's got nothing to do with your ability to work. I just think that's so much about what the dialogue that comes out sometimes when you're talking about women in the workplace. Women do have more rules.
Yeah, and I found that the best way that when I was doing it, and again I kind of reflect on that when I'm doing a PhD, is that wearing the right clothes allowed me to do the job, because it was the thing that got me in the room with the people that I needed to get into the room with. And what was interesting, and what I write about, is that when I started, I was like, if I just put on a suit, then that's fine. And I wrote the chapter that I wrote was called a PhD Barbie Gets a Makeover, because in my head I was like, I'm just like the Barbie, and all I need is I need to take off the PhD outfit and put on the suit outfit, and then I'll be able to go in. And actually, it didn't work at the beginning, because actually, if you're doing it inauthentically, it's not going to work. And actually, it's about getting the balance between those two things, because you still have to be able to do your job, because otherwise you spend your whole day thinking about what your makeup's doing and not what your job is doing.
So I know that there was a question, but I just want to say, you see, I think it's important not to just say women have more rules. On the subject of dress, there are more rules for men in the workplace. There just are. Now, they might be more comfortable with them. We might assume they're more accustomed to them. And actually, it might be seen as an advantage because there's more guidance about what's appropriate to wear. But, bluntly, we've got to look at this actually just as a diversity inclusion question about not just what women can wear, but what are we comfortable with men? Are there rules that can change there? So I'm looking at all the men in the room and saying, do you want to wear a fluorescent pink shirt? And is that okay? And what will your clients say about that? What will your colleagues say about that? And actually that basically you're allowed a blue shirt. If you're really lucky, you can have a pale pink shirt, and then you can actually have a white shirt, and that's your choice. And that's it. And if you go about that, you're going to be seen as a little flamboyant. Does that indicate something about your sexuality? I think there are even more questions there, and it's important that we have to acknowledge those and those barriers and understand that we're then operating within an area where there's, an unconscious bias. And that is, thinking fast, slow. Unconscious bias can work for you, and you need to use it tactically.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'd just like to thank you so much for coming to give us your contributions. We really, really do value them. And thank you all for attending this important event and such an important topic that we hope you will continue to engage with. And if you would like to ask more questions, the panellists will be sticking around for about half an hour. So for those who have to go off to work, we understand that you can stick around to ask the panellists questions. But thank you all again, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.